And when I noticed when you were taking our practice test, you finished basically all 4 sections within an hour, and the test itself is supposed to be 2 hours, right? And so I think clearly, you have this skill with time management. And so for those kids who struggle with time management, what would you recommend on that side as well?
So for that, I would kind of attribute my success even on the paper SAT and my ability to read kind of fast. And I think that comes from just reading a lot. I wouldn't say that I was a complete bookworm or an avid book reader, but I do think nowadays and especially before I took the SAT, my parents would always tell me, the best way to prepare for your test is to read a lot of news articles, especially because the paper SAT, it had a lot of nonfiction, long passages. So just reading articles from the New York Times or just any reliable news source was always helpful. And I feel like reading a lot always helps with increasing your reading speed. That is the most important to actually managing your time well. And I feel like it's also important to do as many practice tests as possible so that you know how long you're going to take on a certain question. Because just to talk about my actual experience on the day I took the SAT, I remember looking at the 5 passages and then realizing that, okay, I really don't like history passages. And then I realized that the 4th passage out of the 5, the 4th one was a history passage. And then I was like, okay, I want to do this last. I want to spend the most time on it. So then I looked at the 5th one and then I realized that it was a science passage. And then since I was the most confident on the science passages, I did that one first. And then I gave myself a lot more time to spend on the 4th passage. That was part of the reason why my accuracy was so great.
So, you said that it's important to take a lot of tests, but how many practice tests would you actually recommend, would you say?
I would recommend taking as many as possible, but to say a number, I would say at least 10.
And so with TestQube, not only do we have 11 full test sets, but we also have the additional adaptive modules in each of the test sets so that students can get really a comprehensive look of what the actual test will be like regardless of performance. And so that's what I think allows TestQube to really stand apart from other platforms. So you just mentioned that you actually thought the difficulty of TestQube and the Bluebook were similar. But actually, I think our test is a little bit more difficult than the Bluebook platform. And we try to offer a little bit more of a difficult experience so that on test day, students don't come to the test overwhelmed by the difficulty of the exam, right? So it's easier to, have students endure this brutal storm and then feel less overwhelmed on test day than the opposite, right? And so now that we've talked about the rigor, I'm also curious about your thoughts on, the functionality. Did you feel like the functionality was similar on the Bluebook versus TestQube? And what did you think of overall the functionality on both tests?
I think the functionalities were mostly similar too. I think TestQube did a great job of replicating the actual testing atmosphere, and especially because the UI was very similar. And I also thought the embedding of Desmos was particularly helpful, and I was really glad to see that there because obviously when I took the paper SAT, I didn't have that available. I had to use a calculator, and I feel like for me personally, I like using Desmos for all things math, so it was a delight to see that there. And I just think, the functionalities on TestQube were seamless.
So now moving on, so when you went through all these questions on the reading and writing section, I'm sure that you found some types of questions easier and others harder. Of the question types that you faced, what do you think gave you the most difficulty on the reading and writing section?
I think I would definitely say that there were some question types in the paper SAT that hit me as harder, but on the digital SAT that I just took, I think the hardest question type was probably the which quote illustrates the claim the best. I think it was that question type. Partly because the quotes were often not in modern English. Like a lot of the passages were from classics and old texts, which I don't particularly enjoy reading. But it was interesting to see that some of the passages there were from works that I've already read before. For example, like Animal Farm or The Importance of Being Earnest and a bunch of other works, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a poem. And I just thought that a lot of the texts were written in older English, and that made it kind of difficult to choose a quote.
And so, with that kind of question, where you have a poem and, having only done the paper SAT, there weren't any poem questions, right? So for poem type questions, what would you recommend for students? How do you think that they could become ready for such kinds of questions?
Well, for me personally, I think when I read fiction, and especially fiction that's written in older English, I think it's really important to understand the text before you get into the question. So even when I was doing the paper SAT, I didn't particularly enjoy reading the fiction passages because the wording, the phrasing, and the diction is often more convoluted. And that's why I prefer scientific passages. So I thought it was always really important to spend a lot of time actually comprehending and feeling like you completely understand the text. And I feel like that applies to poems too, because often poems aren't very direct with what they're trying to say. So I think it's really important to be exposed to a lot of that type of language. So maybe just read many poems or solve many practice tests so that you're exposed to enough poems written in that type of language so that you don't feel shocked or surprised by the things you encounter during the actual test.
And, one part of getting a 1600 and preparing for the SAT is obviously, studying and taking as many practice tests as possible. But what about those, silly mistakes that students make? What do you think enabled you to not make those silly mistakes? And you could be perfect at the SAT and then just on test day, you could, freeze up and make one silly mistake and not even know about it, right? So what do you recommend on that end?
So for that, I actually have a pretty based response because it's something I'm pretty passionate about, and it's sleep. I think it's really, really, really important to get enough sleep for your test. And this is what I do all the time, even for tests I take at school, but especially for larger tests like AP tests or the SAT, I always made sure that I got sufficient sleep, more than enough sleep before the day of. So I think the extent to which you can actually focus during the test is really important, especially when you're trying to comprehend really dense texts. It's really important that your brain is wide awake. And I feel like what a lot of people overlook is the importance of being awake.
Sure.
So I think it's really easy to think that you're awake, but if you compare your performance on a day where you got 4 hours of sleep versus 8 hours of sleep, personally, I can see the difference. I can see the difference in my performance and my results. So I always put sleep as my priority, and I feel like that's obviously really important.
So, I came close personally, but I wasn't able to get that I took the SAT when it was 2400 back in the day. I wasn't able to get that 2400 exactly, but I came close. And so, I always thought, day after day, what would it be like to click on the College Board website and see that 1600, that 2400 come out? And so how did you feel about that when you actually got it?
So I was actually lying on my bed in the morning. So I think in Korean time, the SAT scores usually come out during the evening at 9 p.m. or something. So I remember the day before I actually looked at my score, I was like, why isn't my score coming out? And then for some reason, I think I wanted to sleep early that day. So I went to sleep without seeing my score. And then I just woke up and then I was on my phone or something, scrolling through TikTok or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the email came saying, oh, your score has been updated, status updated or something like that. And then I just clicked on it and then I saw my score on my bed. and my parents didn't even know I was awake because I hadn't left my room. And then so I was like, 엄마, 아빠, 점수 만점 나왔어. It was nice, but it was I think it was a Saturday morning or something like that. So it wasn't that dramatic.
Got a 1600, not that dramatic, not a biggie.
Yeah, but I totally didn't expect it. I think I kind of knew that I did well, but I obviously wasn't expecting to get a full score.
Sure.
Yeah.
So now these days, what are you up to these days as a senior? I'm sure you're busy.
Yeah, very. I've been working on my college applications, obviously because the deadline is coming up in a few months. So I've been pretty busy with that, writing essays, trying to figure out my activities list, and also just trying to juggle my summer life and studying for classes I'm taking in senior year, and just getting myself mentally prepared also for the stress that's coming in the following months. and also just working constantly, I guess.
You know, interests major-wise or, you know, professional-wise? What are you thinking?
I think it's hard to say that I have one thing that I want to pursue in my life as of now, because I'm interested in quite a lot of things. Some of them are like computer science, communications, and a lot of the things I do currently in high school. Yeah, I think that's something I think I will be figuring out once I get to college.
Sure. So thank you so much for, you know, coming down and speaking with us today. It was really interesting to hear from the perspective of someone who, you know, did so well on a paper SAT and is experimenting with, you know, the digital SAT for the first time. And so I hope that you had a good time today. And I'm sure that everyone that's listening will, you know, gain a lot from your advice and everything that you gave today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So make sure to subscribe to our TestQube channel where you can continue to find out more information about the digital SAT and practice with us. Thank you.